It was supposed to be a happy day. Balloons floating near the ceiling tables, laid with pastel cloths and champagne flutes, and women in floral dresses clinking glasses in polite laughter. My son's fiancée was radiant, I'll admit that. She always had that sharp, camera-ready beauty that looked good in every light. But I wasn't there for decorations or the tiny cupcakes with gold leaf frosting. I came with something in my hands, something that had taken me 3 weeks to make and even longer to choose. A quilt, not just fabric and thread, but decades of memory stitched together in soft, aching silence. One square was cut from my husband's old shirt, another from a piece of my wedding dress, tiny embroidery outlined with love and time. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd appreciate something from the heart. When I handed her the box, wrapped carefully in ivory paper and tied with a lace ribbon, she smiled that polite smile, the one people use when they're being watched. She peeled back the paper, lifted the quilt out, and for one brief moment I saw her fingers pause, as if they recognized the weight of the work. But then it came. That laugh. It was light, almost casual, but it carried poison. "This gift looks so cheap," she said, not even bothering to lower her voice. Her friends laughed, not cruelly perhaps, but complicitly. And my son, he didn't say a word, just looked away and refilled someone's drink. I stood there, my hands trembling in my lap. I don't even think I was breathing. The laughter didn't last long, but the silence afterward, that stayed. It stretched across the room, a soft blanket of shame that wrapped only around me. No one said thank you. No one even pretended to care. I felt like a ghost who had tried to leave behind something meaningful, only to be reminded that I was no longer seen as anything important, just a body taking up space and moments. I sat through the rest of that shower, like a statue, smiling when I was supposed to, nodding when someone passed me a plate of cold finger sandwiches. But inside I was drifting far away. It wasn't just about the gift you see. It was what it represented. All those years of trying, of giving, of being generous when I couldn't afford to be, of helping even when I was tired to my bones. And now when all I wanted was to be part of a new chapter in my son's life, I was reduced to a punchline, a woman whose offering was laughed at and then set aside. I looked around that room and saw people who didn't know me, didn't want to know me. The women surrounding her, her bridesmaids, her friends, even her mother spoke in a different language, one I had never been fluent in. Their world was shiny and curated, built for the perfect Instagram picture. Mine was quieter, messier, and maybe a little worn down around the edges. But it was real, and real didn't matter here. I tried to remind myself that maybe she didn't mean it. Maybe it was a careless joke, nerves from the pressure of the day. But the part that stayed with me wasn't even her words. It was the lack of my son's. Not once did he stand up for me. Not once did he say, "She made that with her own hands," or even just, "Mom, thank you." And that was when I felt the first crack. Not a break, no. Not yet. Just the faintest shift, like when a tree root quietly pushes through concrete. Something was changing inside me, something slow and buried. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Tired of trying to belong where I wasn't wanted. Tired of giving my best and watching it be dismissed like scraps. I went home that evening, quiltless, joyless, and heavy with something I couldn't name yet. I looked at the empty corner in my room where the box had sat for weeks, waiting to be given. I sat in my chair, the one that creaks just a little when I settle into it, and stared at nothing for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat, watching the light, dim through the curtains, listening to the hum of silence in a house that used to hold so much noise. It was the beginning of something, though I didn't know it yet. a reckoning perhaps, or maybe just the first honest look I had allowed myself to take in years. I had always believed that love meant giving without expectation, that if I just kept showing up, they'd eventually let me in. But something about that moment, the laughter, the silence, the careless insult, had shifted the floor beneath me. Maybe love wasn't supposed to feel like begging. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be this exhausting. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop showing up where I wasn't seen at all. I wasn't always like this, you know. So careful with my words, so quiet in my steps. There was a time I used to enter rooms with ease, offer opinions freely, even laugh too loud, and not care who heard. But over the years, life wore me down like water wears down stone. Slowly, persistently, one small dismissal at a time. And when it came to my son's life, his partners, his plans, his celebrations, I began shrinking myself just to fit. At first it was subtle. I stopped giving advice unless asked. Then I stopped asking questions. Eventually I stopped expecting to be included in anything beyond the surface. But I never stopped trying. I tried in every way I knew how. Hosting Sunday dinners even when my knees ached. Sending care packages when he moved away for work, though they were barely acknowledged. Baking his favorites whenever they visited, only to be told later that she was gluten-free now and he was doing keto. I smiled through it all. Adapted. Adjusted. I wanted to be the kind of mother-in-law who was easy to love. The kind who stayed out of the way, but was there when needed. But the thing is, when you're too easy to overlook, people start assuming you have nothing worth listening to. I remember one evening when they came over unexpectedly. It was raining, and I had nothing special prepared, just leftovers in the fridge and some tea. She looked around my living room like it was a museum of mistakes. Her eyes flicked from the old clock that was 5 minutes slow to the worn armrest on my favorite chair. So quaint, she'd said with a tight smile. My son looked embarrassed, not for her, but for me, like I had somehow failed to keep up with the version of life they now curated. I cleaned that house top to bottom after they left. Not for them, at least, that's what I told myself, but to prove I still had value, that I could still matter if I just tried a little harder. And that was my trap, you see, that endless cycle of just try harder, as if the problem was me. As if love could be earned like overtime hours. But it wasn't just in their home. Even in public spaces, I started noticing how invisible I'd become. Waiters would address her, even if I was the one asking the question. Invitations to events started arriving with my name as an afterthought or not at all. I'd sit in corners at their parties, offering to help, always saying yes, never speaking up. I told myself that this was what aging looked like, learning how to fade politely. But deep down, I was mourning something I couldn't name. One afternoon, I went shopping for a dress to wear to their engagement dinner. I must have tried on 6 before settling on a soft plum, one simple modest, but with delicate beadwork at the collar. I thought it looked elegant. I showed her a picture. She nodded absently, scrolling on her phone, and said, "It's nice, very you," that you felt like a dismissal, like I belonged in a different chapter than the one they were writing. Still, I wore it anyway, hoping maybe she'd see I was trying. At that dinner, I noticed how their friends circled around her parents, all energy and admiration. Her mother, with her perfectly sculpted hair and expensive perfume, played hostess like it was a pageant. I was seated next to the bathroom. They forgot to introduce me during the toasts. And again, my son said nothing. On the drive home, I whispered to myself, maybe next time. Maybe next time they'd see how much I cared. Maybe next time he'd remember who raised him. Maybe next time she'd say thank you. But time kept moving, and the next times kept getting thinner, further colder. I remember one Sunday when I brought over an old photo album. I thought it might be nice to share some childhood memories with her, let her see the boy he used to be. She flipped through a few pages politely before setting it aside. "We're trying to move forward," she said, like the past was a chain we needed to cut. My heart sank. All those memories, his scraped knees, his school plays, our camping trips packed away like clutter in a garage. And still I tried. I kept showing up, brought over soup when they were sick, sewed a button on his coat when I noticed it was loose, sent little texts, thinking of you both with emojis I wasn't sure how to use. I said yes to babysitting her niece once, even though I was exhausted. I loaned them money to replace their dishwasher even when I needed to fix my leaking roof. I never made them feel guilty for it. I just wanted to help. I thought helping was love. I thought being useful was the only way to stay relevant. But now thinking back on all of it, I see it wasn't love. I was receiving in return. It was tolerance. And tolerance is not the same thing as acceptance. It's a polite rejection wrapped in pleasantries. I was tolerated like background music in a coffee shop, inoffensive, ignorable, unnecessary. And there's a loneliness in being tolerated by your own family that no one warns you about. It creeps in quietly. You feel it when your calls go unanswered, when your text gets a thumbs up instead of a reply, when they show up late to your birthday dinner and leave early. You learn to stop asking. You learn to expect less, and you call it maturity. But it's really grief in disguise. I used to think love was about holding on no matter what. But maybe, just maybe, it's also about knowing when to let go. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect, out of the aching, stubborn belief that you still deserve to be treated with care. The first time I visited their new house, I brought along a loaf of my apple cinnamon bread, still warm, wrapped in a clean dish towel and tied with a bit of twine. It smelled like autumn and memories. I had imagined her face lighting up when I handed it to her. I had hoped for a smile, a real one. But when she opened the door and saw me standing there with my offering, she looked past me before even saying hello. Her voice was pleasant but clipped. "Oh, that's sweet. You didn't have to." That phrase again, "you didn't have to." A polite way of saying I didn't want you to. Their house was beautiful, spotless, decorated in that curated magazine style that makes you feel like breathing too hard might smudge something. White walls, pale furniture, little trays of polished stones, and candles that smelled like sea salt and privilege. It was modern, elegant, and cold. No photos on the fridge, no signs of wear, no soul. Everything in its place. Including me, it seemed, sat on the edge of the couch, like a guest in a showroom, not a mother visiting her son. She offered me lemon water in a glass so thin, I was afraid to hold it. No one offered tea. No one asked if I was tired from the drive. I watched her flit from room to room, adjusting pillows that didn't need adjusting, checking on a playlist that no one was listening to. And he, my son, he barely met my eyes. He was always like that around her, softer in the spine. I used to think love made a person stronger. Now I wonder if some kinds of love just turn people quiet. I noticed the photo on the wall in the hallway, a large print of them on the beach somewhere expensive, the sunset behind them, arms wrapped around each other, tanned and glowing. I stood there looking at it for a moment. Not a single family photo in the whole house. None of him as a child. None of us. As if he had been born into her arms, clean and new without history or roots. I wondered then what it felt like to have your whole life rewritten by someone else's aesthetic. I wondered if he noticed. Dinner was served on plates that probably cost more than my entire kitchen. Tiny servings, decorative. I offered to help clean up, but she waved me off like a polite inconvenience. Just Relax, she said without meaning it. So I sat on that couch again, listening to them talk about people I didn't know, plans I hadn't been told about, venues they were considering for the wedding. I wasn't included in the conversation, just seated beside it. Later, when they talked about their honeymoon, she mentioned an exclusive resort for adults. Only, of course. She laughed. No crying babies, no nosy relatives. My son chuckled. It was a passing joke, but I heard the message under it. I always heard the message under things. That's what happens when you're the type of woman who's been trained all her life to read the room before you enter it. You listen more than you speak. You observe the spaces between words. And what I observed that night was this. I was a relic. A set piece. Something borrowed for the evening, then returned to the shelf. I wasn't part of the life they were building. I was an obligation. A figure from the past they felt too guilty to discard, but too embarrassed to bring fully into their future. When I left, she hugged me at the door, arms light as bird wings. We should do this again soon, she said, already turning back inside. My son said nothing, just gave me that half smile he'd been perfecting ever since he met her, the one that says, don't make a scene, don't ask for more. I drove home in silence. No radio, no thoughts, just the sound of tires on pavement and the dull ache of disappointment setting into my chest. I thought of the bread, still sitting on her counter untouched. I thought of how I had spent the whole week perfecting the glaze, and I realized then that it had never really been about the bread. It was about being seen. It was about wanting someone to say, I know how much effort this took, thank you. But gratitude had no home in their house. Only presentation did. Only surface. I tried to imagine their wedding. Would I even be introduced properly? Would I be seated near the back with distant cousins and co-workers? Would she let me say a toast? No, of course not. My voice didn't match the color palette. I wasn't the mother of the groom she wanted. I didn't sparkle, didn't fit into her grid of filtered photos. And still I told myself, it's okay. You're overthinking. Just give it time. But in my heart I knew better. I had been telling myself, just give it time for years, and time had been quietly erasing me. There was a time not so long ago really when every little thing I did was met with gratitude. A smile, a thank you, a kind word that told me I was seen. I wasn't doing anything extraordinary, just ordinary mothering. Packing lunches, folding laundry, staying up late with fevered children, making birthdays feel like magic even when money was tight. Back then my hands were always busy and my heart was full. Tired, yes, but full. Gratitude was the thread that held me together. Not the big declarations, just the small thing. Like when my son would hug me around the waist and say, you're the best mom, with jelly on his fingers and all the truth in the world in his eyes. But somewhere along the way, that thread frayed, slowly, quietly, until I barely noticed it was gone. The gestures didn't change, I still gave, still showed up, but the response shifted. They started calling it expected. As if my kindness was a subscription service they never had to renew. And when I finally did stop doing something, it wasn't missed. It was criticized. Why didn't I bring the casserole? Why wasn't I available that weekend? Why did I say no even once? It hurt more than I could say, not because I needed praise, but because I needed to feel like I mattered. And when people stop thanking you, they're not just forgetting manners. They're telling you they've stopped noticing. I remember one specific evening not long before the bridal shower when she had a cold. My son was away on a work trip, and I offered to drop by with some homemade chicken soup and run a few errands. She agreed, but when I arrived, she didn't come to the door. Just texted, "Leave it on the porch. Thanks." I stood there for a minute, soup container in my hands, watching the light flicker behind her closed blinds. I left it on the step, walked back to my car, and sat in the driver's seat longer than I should have. I felt ridiculous, like a delivery driver for a person who wouldn't open the door for me. 2 days later, I got a message soup was fine, a little salty. Thanks. No heart emoji, no follow-up. I read it twice, 3 times, and then I deleted it. That moment lived inside me, like a small stone in my shoe, not big enough to stop me walking, but always there, grinding. It wasn't just the absence of gratitude. It was the erosion of something sacred, that invisible connection between two people who take care of each other, even in silence. At Christmas the year before, I had spent weeks planning the meal. Baked ham with my grandmother's glaze, honeyed carrots, soft rolls, pies from scratch. She brought a store-bought cake with Merry Xmas printed crookedly in plastic lettering. When I served dinner, she barely touched her plate, pushed food around with her fork like it was an audition for disdain. Later, she joked to someone, "Her cooking's just old-fashioned." She said it with a smile, as though that made it okay. My son laughed, not because it was funny, but because that's what he did now laugh when she did. Like her approval had become his oxygen. And yet I still tried. Still brought small gifts when I visited. Still texted check-ins when I hadn't heard from them in days. Still bought birthday presents for her family, even when they never remembered mine. Still gave money when they hinted at financial stress. Always hinted, never asked directly, because that way they didn't have to say thank you either. I kept giving because I believed that's what love does. I thought if I stayed generous, eventually their hearts would soften. Eventually they'd see the woman behind the gestures. But they didn't, and I was beginning to see they never would. You start to notice these things most in the quiet, in the pauses between texts, in the forgotten invitations, in the photos posted online that you weren't in. I'd scroll and see them smiling at brunch with her family, or taking trips with friends, and I'd realize I didn't even know they'd been gone. My phone never rang. My name never appeared in captions. I became a background figure, the person who watched, but wasn't part of the scene. It's strange, isn't it? How a person can fade from someone's life while still standing right in front of them. What I had to admit, slowly, painfully, was that I had trained them to stop seeing me. Every time I gave without asking for recognition, I taught them it was okay not to appreciate it. Every time I bit my tongue instead of speaking truth, I taught them my silence was acceptable. I hadn't just been ignored. I had allowed myself to be erased. And when the gratitude vanished, something else filled its place. Entitlement. They expected me to show up, to help, to pay, to adjust. There was no please, no if you're up to it. Only assumptions, only taking. And the longer I let it happen, the deeper the wound became. But the worst part, the part I hadn't wanted to face, was that I was complicit in my own diminishing. I kept thinking, if I just gave a little more, smiled a little longer, waited a little harder, they'd finally notice. But people don't notice what they've grown used to. They don't appreciate what's always available. I had made myself available to the point of vanishing. And now all I could feel was the weight of that vanishing, like a fog that no one else could see but I carried every day, and I was beginning to wonder if it was too late to reclaim myself from it. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't strike you like a thunderbolt. It trickles in. A slow drip, one you try to ignore at first, telling yourself it's nothing, until one day it's a flood. And when I heard them laughing behind the door that night, I felt that flood rise to my throat. I wasn't supposed to hear it. That's what makes it worse, I think. The things people say, when they're sure you're not listening, those are the truths. They keep quiet to your face. It was the week after the bridal shower. I had come by to drop off some fabric swatches for the handkerchiefs I had planned to embroider for the wedding guests. Something small and sentimental, just like I used to do back when weddings were family affairs, not styled photo shoots. She had asked for something handmade to include as favors, and I thought this would be meaningful. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I knew they were home. Their car was in the driveway. I figured maybe they were in the backyard, so I walked around the side of the house to knock on the patio door. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Her voice high and sharp, like wind through cracked glass. "Did you see her face when I called the quilt cheap?" she said, laughing so hard she had to catch her breath. She looked like someone kicked her cat. Then someone else, a friend I think, joined in. "You're awful." But she didn't sound disapproving. She sounded delighted, the kind of delighted that comes from being cruel and knowing you won't be punished for it. And then my son's voice, low chuckling. "I told you not to say it so loud." Not "don't say it," not that was hurtful, just not so loud. I stood frozen beneath their kitchen window, the swatches trembling in my hand. My breath caught in my chest like a moth in a jar. For a moment I thought I might collapse right there on their perfect pesticide-treated lawn, because in that moment it was no longer just about a thoughtless gift remark. It was mockery, shared mockery, a private joke I had unknowingly starred in. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't ring again. I just turned around and walked back to my car, the swatches still clutched in my hand like soft little flags of surrender. I drove home in silence, though the noise inside me was unbearable. And once I was home, I sat at the table, the swatches laid out before me, and I stared at them for a long time. They were beautiful. Cream rose, pale blue colors I'd chosen carefully, tenderly, like preparing a bouquet from a garden I'd tended all my life. But now, under the cold kitchen light, they looked like something else entirely. Evidence of my foolishness. I packed them away. I didn't tell anyone what I heard, not at first. Not even my sister when she called later that week and asked how the preparations were going. I just said, "Fine." Because what else do you say when you realize your son is laughing at you behind your back? When you hear him choose peace with her over respect for you, you say nothing. You swallow it. And that silence festers. But I couldn't unhear it. The sound of their laughter played over and over in my head like a cruel lullaby. I started to doubt every moment. Had they always laughed like that? Had I been a joke to them for years? Was every polite nod, every birthday card, every tight-lipped smile just a cover for how little they truly respected me? I thought about all the sacrifices, the hours I worked overtime when he was young just to afford his school supplies, the shoes I never bought for myself so he could have the better brand, the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, baking cupcakes for class, driving to early practices. All of it memories to me, but maybe just punchlines to them. The betrayal didn't come like a sharp slap. It came like a slow spreading frost. Cold at first, then unbearable. I realized I had spent years inviting people into my heart who only wanted to redecorate the space and laugh about the wallpaper. And yet, part of me still tried to forgive. I told myself maybe it was just one moment. Maybe it was nerves, stress, too much champagne. Maybe they didn't realize how cruel it was. But I knew better. You don't laugh like that about someone you respect. You don't speak that way about someone you love. That night I sat in bed and stared at the ceiling for hours, not crying, just still, so still. Like the part of me that had always hoped, had always made excuses, always tried to belong, had finally run out of energy. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't vindictive. I was just empty. And it's a dangerous thing, that kind of emptiness, Because when a woman gives and gives and gives, and all she gets in return is mockery, that emptiness becomes a womb for something else, something colder, something stronger, the beginnings of resolve. I didn't know what I would do yet. I just knew something inside me had changed. And when a mother changes not in her mood, but in her marrow, the world around her begins to shift too. The next time they invited me over, it was Easter, a cheerful little brunch with pastel decorations and those tiny folded name cards at every plate. Her mother's name in calligraphy sat at the head of the table. Mine was tucked somewhere near the middle between a co-worker of hers and an old friend from college who didn't even remember meeting me before. I smiled, said hello, made light conversation. I was good at that. Years of learning how to be palatable, acceptable, easy. I brought a little basket filled with handmade chocolates, wrapped in cellophane tied with gold ribbon. I'd seen the idea in a magazine, thought it might be nice festive. I handed it to her as I arrived, and she took it with a chirp of a smile. Oh, wow, cute. We already have tons of sweets, but thanks. And then she turned away, just like that, like I was another guest at a party she barely had time to acknowledge. And when I sat at the table, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The plates were all matching now, some kind of high-end ceramic, with delicate edges. She had replaced the old ones I'd gifted them 2 Christmases ago. I recognized those plates clearly, because I had spent weeks saving up for them. They weren't expensive by her standards, but they were elegant, classic, and now gone. Instead of flowers from her garden, the centerpiece was a generic bouquet with store tags still attached. Her friends brought wine and bath bombs and gift cards. I watched her open one card, squeal, "A spa voucher, thank you," and then toss the envelope into a bin behind her. No one noticed how my basket sat unopened by the window. There was a kind of sadness to the whole scene, though none of them saw it. A thinness, a hollowness behind the laughter. I looked around and realized this was a table of people so used to surface that they'd forgotten how to go deep. Everyone smiling too wide, eating too little, complimenting things they didn't mean. I thought of all the tables I'd set over the years, messy, loud, chaotic, full of overcooked meals and second helpings and children running through the kitchen, and I missed them. Missed the feeling of real life, not this curated silence. At one point, she stood to make a toast. She thanked everyone for coming, praised her mother for helping plan, gave a nod to her bridesmaids, then raised her glass and said, "Here's to the family we choose." Everyone cheered. My glass stayed on the table. It's not that I wasn't used to being overlooked. I had made peace with being peripheral. But that moment, those words, it felt like a final erasure, a declaration. They had chosen and I was not part of it. I was the obligation, the inherited piece of furniture you're too guilty to throw away, but too embarrassed to display. And yet I stayed through dessert, helped gather plates, wiped a spill no one saw, sat in a kitchen chair while they talked about the bachelorette party, the wedding colors, the honeymoon itinerary. I wasn't included in any of it. At one point, I even offered to help cover the cost of the florist, something I knew they were struggling with. She smiled, said that'd be helpful, then turned to someone else to complain about how much peonies cost. No, thank you. Not even a flicker of appreciation. Just expectation. When I got home that night, I looked at my calendar. 3 events left until the wedding. I was invited to all of them, but I knew now what that meant. A seat in the corner, a polite smile, a nod of acknowledgement, but never inclusion. I thought about all the ways I had tried to stay relevant. The handmade gifts, the money, the presents, the patience. And I thought if I died tomorrow, They'd probably say something nice at the funeral post, a filtered photo with a caption like, "Heaven gained an angel," but they wouldn't feel it. They wouldn't ache, because they'd already learned to live without needing me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed watching the ceiling fan turn and turn slow and steady, like a clock that had forgotten its purpose. I remembered my own wedding. Small, chaotic. A tablecloth my aunt had burned with an iron. Laughing cousins, my mother making a toast with tears in her eyes. The cake was lopsided, and my husband stepped on my dress during our first dance. But it was ours. Real. Imperfect. Loved. What they were building now, it was beautiful in the way marble is beautiful. Cold. Smooth. Without memory. I realized then that no matter how hard I tried, I would never belong to that family. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because they weren't capable of recognizing the kind of love I offered. They wanted sleek, polished things. I was worn in, weathered, real. And I began to wonder if they couldn't be grateful when I gave everything. What would they do if I stopped? What would they do if I gave nothing at all? I suppose every mother knows the day will come when her child belongs more to someone else than to her. We prepare ourselves for it. At least we try. We tell ourselves it's a sign we did something right, raise them to be independent, to love, to build a life that isn't tethered to us. But what they never tell you is how strange it feels when the person you once rocked to sleep begins to look at you like a visitor, or worse, a burden. And when my son started echoing her tones, mirroring her silences, speaking to me with a practiced patience I'd never heard from him before, I knew I had lost him. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part. If he had slammed a door, shouted that he wanted nothing to do with me, maybe it would have been easier to grieve. But it was slow, gentle even, like watching fog roll in and not realizing it's already stolen your view. At first it was just in the small things, the way he'd let her answer for him, how his texts to me got shorter, how his visits always seemed rushed, like he was timing them in his head. Once I asked if he could help me fix the back gate. He said he'd come by Saturday. Saturday came, then Sunday, then silence. When I finally asked about it, he said, "Oh, sorry, we had plans." Plans? I wasn't mad about the gate. I was mad that I wasn't part of the conversation, that I wasn't worth a call, a reschedule, a thought. He used to tell me everything. He'd call on his way home from work, even if it was just to talk about traffic or a strange coworker. Now I found out news through social media. New job, new dog. Engagement photos. Once a neighbor asked me about their trip to Thailand. I hadn't even known they'd gone. The distance became geography, then became something else entirely, something deeper. I would watch the way he looked at her, so deferent, so careful, like he was constantly trying to read her face before speaking. I recognized that look. I used to have it myself back when I spent years walking on eggshells in a marriage that stole more from me than it gave. It scared me seeing that expression on his face, that mixture of pride and fear, of love laced with appeasement. But I said nothing. I was his mother, not his therapist. And besides, he never asked. One night I called just to say hi. He answered with, "Everything okay? Not hi, Mom. Not nice to hear from you?" Just the cautious tone of someone bracing for a request. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said I just wanted to hear your voice. He sighed softly, but I heard it. We're in the middle of something. Can I call you later? I said. Of course, he never did. I started keeping a list quietly, just for me, of all the ways he had slipped away. Not out of bitterness, but out of bewilderment. Like I was trying to make sense of a slow unraveling, like counting the threads would stop the whole cloth from coming apart. And the worst part, I began to doubt myself. Was I too needy, too old-fashioned? Had I somehow earned this distance, without realizing it? I picked apart every conversation, wondering what I'd said wrong, wondering if my voice had become grating, my presence inconvenient, wondering if her coldness had a reason I simply didn't understand. But then came the day that shattered whatever illusions I had left. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way. I had dropped by to leave a basket of groceries on their porch. Some things I knew they liked, and a few extras I thought she might appreciate. Just a small kindness. I knocked, expecting the usual silence, but she opened the door. I could tell by her face she wasn't thrilled to see me. "Oh, hi," she said, holding the door halfway open. I asked if she had a moment. "Not really," she replied, glancing over her shoulder. And then I heard him, his voice in the background. "Is it your mom again?" "Your mom. Not my mom. Not mom. Just a name used like a problem, and something in me broke. I don't even remember what I said after that. Something polite, something deflecting. I handed her the bag and walked away as quickly as I could without looking like I was running. But inside I was unraveling, because that wasn't just a slip of the tongue. That was how he saw me now, as someone she had to manage, as someone outside his life, not central to it. I got in the car and stared at the steering wheel, my keys still in my lap, and I said it out loud just once, just to myself. He isn't my boy anymore. And as soon as I said it, I felt this strange combination of grief and clarity wash over me. Like naming it made it real, like admitting it set something free. He wasn't mine anymore, not in the way he used to be, not in the way I had loved him, raised him, protected him. That little boy who used to climb into my lap sticky with peanut butter and full of dreams, that boy was gone. In his place was a man with other allegiances, other priorities, other truths, and I couldn't follow him there. I drove home and sat in my kitchen lights off the basket of backup groceries still in the trunk. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just sat with the truth heavy and full. Because the truth was this: I had spent too long loving someone who had already placed me on the outer ring of his life. And maybe it was time I stepped off that ring completely. When the invitation arrived, it was sent through email. No envelope, no handwritten note, just a generic link with RSVP options and registry details like a business announcement instead of a family celebration. You're invited to the bridal shower honoring, followed by her name in large cursive mine nowhere in sight. I stared at it on the screen for a long time. No mention of me helping host, even though I'd offered months ago. No mention of my address, my garden, or my kitchen, none of the things that used to mean home in our family. Just a location at some expensive venue downtown, all glass and modern chairs and no room for softness. Still, I clicked yes. Of course I did. I went out and bought a new blouse for the occasion. Soft lavender, a color I hadn't worn in years. I had my hair set the day before, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel like I had some part in this chapter. I even wore a brooch my own mother had given me on my wedding day, hoping foolishly that it might spark a story, a connection, some thread of continuity across generations. But when I walked into that room, no one looked twice. The walls were white and echoing the tables set with tall centerpieces of roses and peonies, the scent so thick it sat on the tongue. Every chair had a name tag, every napkin folded into cranes, and at the head table sat her family, all glowing like they had already won something. I searched the room for my son, knowing he wouldn't be there, still hoping absurdly he'd walk in and smile just for me. He didn't. I was seated at a table far from the front between two women who barely spoke to me. One was a coworker of hers, the other a cousin I hadn't seen in years. They smiled politely when I sat down, then turned back to their phones. I looked at my lap, at my hands folded neatly there. They had done so much over the years. Wiped tears, held babies, sewn costumes, and now they just sat there, unnoticed. The event unfolded like a performance, a curated timeline, speeches, laughter games. Her mother took the microphone and spoke with that confident, polished tone of someone used to being heard. She talked about how proud she was, how excited she was to gain a son. And I waited for her to mention me, even once. But she didn't. No one did. Not one word. Not even when they handed out favors or shared stories. I wasn't asked to stand. I wasn't invited to speak. I wasn't given the floor, the spotlight, or even a flicker of gratitude. I was just there, like furniture, like wallpaper. When it came time for the gift opening, the room leaned in. Beautiful wrapping paper, fancy ribbons, expensive brands. She gushed over every item posed for photos, kissed cheeks. And then came the box I had wrapped myself quietly, without expectation, but with care. I watched her untie the ribbon, lift the quilt. My quilt, the one I had poured my breath and memory into. There was a moment, just one, where I saw her fingers pause. She traced a seam. She noticed the embroidery. And then she laughed. This gift looks so cheap. I felt the air drain from the room, or maybe just from me. Laughter rippled across the table. Not cruel, just casual, easy. Like dismissing me was the most natural thing in the world. Like the hours, the stitches, the aching fingers meant nothing. And my son, he wasn't there to defend me. But even if he had been, I knew now he wouldn't have. He would have laughed too, or looked away, or said something like, "She means well." I sat perfectly still, smiled, nodded, pretended I didn't hear, pretended I didn't feel the sting rising hot in my throat. And I knew then and there that I was done pretending. When the event ended, no one thanked me for coming. No one hugged me goodbye. I gathered my purse, stood up slowly, and walked to the door alone. The sunlight outside felt too bright, like the world was trying too hard to shine. I stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the city blur around me. I felt like I was waking up from a long, cruel dream. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. I thought about how many other mothers had probably sat like this, in quiet seats, wearing soft blouses and brooches that meant something to no one. I wondered how many of them had been erased without even realizing it. How many had tried to stay soft in a world that demanded steel. I arrived home, put my purse down gently, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the light. Just sat, listened to the sound of the clock ticking, time moving on without me. I looked at the chair across from mine, the one he used to sit in, swinging his legs, asking for more juice. That boy was gone. And in his place, a man who now belonged to someone else. The shower wasn't mine. The celebration wasn't mine. And maybe the future wasn't mine either, not the way I had hoped. But the silence I carried home that day, that silence belonged to me. And in that silence I heard something beginning. Not revenge, not rage, but clarity. It's strange the way a single sentence can echo inside you for days. A simple string of words tossed out with a laugh can find its way into every corner of your mind, like smoke curling under a door. This gift looks so cheap. I heard it on a loop at the kitchen sink, folding laundry, brushing my teeth. I heard it more than I heard the sound of my own name. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized it wasn't about the quilt at all. It was about how little they saw me. She didn't say, "This isn't my style." She didn't say, "It's not what I expected." She said cheap a word meant to reduce, to dismiss, to imply something unworthy. It wasn't just a critique of fabric and stitching. It was a verdict, a label. And my son said nothing. Not then, not later, not ever. When he called the next evening, it was brief. He sounded distracted, like someone calling out of obligation. I waited for him to mention the quilt, to say something. She didn't mean it that way, or, "It was beautiful, Mom." But all he said was, "Thanks for coming to the shower." And then he asked if I could still help pay for the rehearsal dinner. That was the moment. That one. I felt my mouth go dry. My fingers gripped the edge of the counter. He didn't even know what had happened. Or worse, he did, and chose not to speak of it. He just kept moving forward as if I were nothing more than a line item on a budget sheet, mother responsible for soup seating charts and financial backing. I said, "Let me think about it." He didn't push, didn't ask if something was wrong, just said, "Okay, let me know," and hung up. The silence after the call was louder than the sentence itself. It buzzed in my ears, coated my skin. I stood there in the kitchen, the phone still in my hand, and I looked at the empty spot on the wall where I'd once hung a drawing he made in the first grade, crayons and glitter and misspelled words. I love my mom. She makes magic soup. It was long gone now, torn, faded, lost in some move. But I remembered it so vividly, it may as well have been in front of me. That child, that messy, beautiful little boy, he never would have let anyone call my gift cheap. He never would have let anyone laugh at me. I wanted to scream, not at them, but at myself, for allowing this to go on so long, for ignoring every sign, for thinking love could be earned with generosity, for mistaking politeness for inclusion, for holding out hope that if I stayed kind enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, they'd finally let me back in. But I wasn't in. I had never been in. I thought of all the hours I spent on that quilt, choosing the fabrics, cutting the squares, carefully lining up the patterns. I had stayed up late working by lamplight, my eyes watering, fingers stiff. Each patch told a story, a square from his childhood blanket, a piece from the dress I wore to his graduation, little embroidery notes tucked along the edge inside jokes only he would understand. I wanted it to be a bridge, a way of saying I remember everything that built you. But to her it was just fabric, just homemade, just cheap. The cruelty wasn't just in the words, it was in the ease with which she said them, the confidence, the laughter that followed, and worst of all, the comfort she had in knowing that no one would challenge her, least of all him. I didn't eat dinner that night. I couldn't. I walked from room to room, turning off lights that had never really warmed the place. I sat in my sewing chair, surrounded by remnants of old projects, baby clothes, holiday aprons, Christmas stockings stitched with initials that hadn't been used in years. All these things I made with love, preserved with care, believing they meant something. Now they just looked like relics. Reminders of a time when my efforts were received with wonder instead of critique. And something inside me began to harden. Not bitter, not cold, just resolute. I wasn't going to cry about it anymore. I wasn't going to defend myself. I wasn't going to send another check or text another apology or show up with another dish or offer another seat at a table that never truly welcomed me. For the first time in years, I sat perfectly still, not out of fear or exhaustion, but out of clarity. I could feel the shape of my own boundaries rising like a tide. Soft, but strong. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to stop giving pieces of myself to people who thought my worth could be measured by a price tag. I whispered it to myself like a prayer. No more. When you're a woman raised in a certain time in a certain way, you learn early that silence is currency. You learn to trade your discomfort for peace, your questions for acceptance. You become fluent in shrinking. You bite your tongue so often it becomes habit or reflex, and eventually you forget what your voice even sounds like when it's not shaped to please someone else. I lived most of my life that way, smiling through disappointments, saying it's okay when it wasn't, pretending things didn't sting when they bled me dry. It didn't start with her, of course. It started long before, with my mother's stern glances, my father's dismissive sighs, with teachers who praised the quiet girls, husbands who loved women who didn't make drama. It started with being told that kindness meant enduring, that being good meant being silent. And over time I became a master of swallowing myself. I've spent a lifetime biting back tears when I opened gifts that showed no one knew me, biting back words when my ideas were overlooked in favor of louder voices, biting back anger when I was taken for granted again and again. And in the name of love, in the name of family, I bit my tongue so often, I wore down the sharp edges of who I was. I did it with my husband, God rest his soul, when he left me out of decisions about our own home. I did it when he told our son to listen to your mother, but don't take her too seriously. I did it when he let his work come before birthdays, anniversaries, even funerals. And I did it with my son, too. From the time he was little, I wanted to be the kind of mother who never made him feel guilty. I overcompensated for the absences in our home. I overgave, overcooked, overloved. And now here I was, 68 years old, still biting my tongue while a girl young enough to be my daughter mocked my love offering in front of a room of strangers, still sitting quietly while my only child let it happen. What do you do with that kind of grief? The kind that's so familiar, you almost forget it's not normal. You start remembering, not in one flash, but in waves. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinner when I served a meal from scratch, and she told everyone they were so lucky to have Postmates if it didn't work out. I remembered when I offered to sew her dress hem, and she said, "We're using a tailor for the aesthetic." I remembered when I asked if I could help plan the wedding, and she blinked and said, "Oh, I thought you wouldn't be up for all that pressure." Each comment, each dismissal was small enough to excuse, just a joke, just a misunderstanding, just stress. But together they formed a pattern, a rope that had been tightening around me one knot at a time. The thing is, when people know you won't push back, they stop being careful with you. They assume your patience is endless, that your love is unconditional in the most dangerous sense, that it requires nothing in return. They take your kindness as a given, your presence as guaranteed, and little by little, they stop valuing what they've never had to earn. I sat on my back porch that evening, listening to the birds settle into the trees. The sky had that dusky blue tint, where the first stars are just starting to peek through. I clutched a cup of tea long gone cold and thought about all the apologies I had written in my life. Real ones, imagined ones, silent ones. I had apologized for being too emotional, too opinionated, too available, too eager, too much. And now I was supposed to apologize for being not enough. Not stylish enough. Not modern enough. Not expensive enough. Not enough for her. But I wasn't the problem. I knew that now. It took too long, but I knew. I wasn't the one who needed to change. I was the one who needed to stop shrinking for people who were never going to make room for me anyway. That night, I didn't bite my tongue. I didn't write another thank you card. I didn't text a follow-up to smooth over the moment. Instead, I took a piece of paper and a pen from the drawer and started writing something else entirely. Not an apology, not an explanation, just the truth. I wrote down everything I had done for them, every payment, every favor, every yes I gave when I should have said no. And beside each one I wrote how they responded, with silence, with expectation, with mockery. When I was done, I folded the paper and slid it into the drawer where I kept important things. My will, my insurance paperwork, my medical notes. Because this wasn't just a vent. It was a reckoning, a map, a record of the moment I finally told myself the truth. They didn't value me. Not because I was worthless, but because I never made them need to. And that was about to change. I had always been a quiet crier. I never liked making noise when I wept, never let my shoulders shake too much. I'd learned early on to cry, in bathrooms, behind closed doors in the car parked just a little too long in grocery store lots. My tears had been my little secret for decades. I wept when my marriage frayed and finally snapped. I wept when the mortgage was late, when the school called again, when I found the old birthday card tucked in a drawer 3 years after he moved out. I had cried in hospital rooms and hotel lobbies and the back row of weddings that weren't mine. So that night, after the shower, after the call, after the paper list, I fully expected the tears to come again. But they didn't. I sat on the edge of my bed, legs curled beneath me, hands cupped around nothing at all, and felt a stillness so wide, so strange, it almost scared me. I didn't feel empty, I felt cleared out, like a house that had been stripped of furniture and finally let light through its windows again. There was no sobbing, no pillow clutched to my chest, just the deep, echoing quiet of a woman who had finally run out of illusions. There is power in that silence, a holy kind of hush. Because that's when I heard myself think, I don't have to keep doing this. The thought came so simply, like a whisper from a part of me that had been hiding under the floorboards for years, a voice I'd smothered under obligation and guilt and the desperate need to be loved. It was my own voice, older, wiser, and finally brave. I stood up, walked barefoot to the mirror, looked at the woman staring back at me. Soft jaw, thinning hair, tired eyes, wrinkles at the corners, some from laughter, but many from worry. I reached up and touched my face, not to adjust anything, not to critique, but to recognize, to finally see her. This woman who had survived so much, who had built a life out of scraps and stitched it all together with faith, who had waited years for a thank you that never came, who had given everything she had over and over and still been made to feel like she was never enough. I said it out loud slowly like a line from a play I'd finally earned the right to perform. You don't have to prove your worth to anyone. And that's when I decided. Not in a dramatic rush, not with fury, but with calm, deliberate certainty. I wasn't going to fund their wedding. Not a dime. I had already paid in time, in sweat and love, in presence, in every unreciprocated gesture. I had paid in silence. And I was done. I opened the drawer where I kept my checkbook, the one that hadn't been touched. Since I paid the deposit on the rehearsal dinner venue 2 months ago, I took out the check I'd written in advance, the one they were counting on, the one she had practically planned her flower budget around. I tore it in half, then again, into 8 pieces. I folded them into my palm like broken promises and dropped them into the bin. I didn't call him. I didn't email. I didn't send a message that would be read out loud between them and twisted into another story where I was the villain. I did nothing, because for the first time in years, doing nothing felt like the strongest thing I could do. That night I went outside with a blanket draped over my shoulders and sat under the stars. They weren't bright city skies, rarely allow it. but they were there, faint and steady. I looked up and let the night wrap around me. The air smelled like lilacs from the bush I planted the year my son turned 10. I remembered him running around barefoot, pretending the world was his, dragging sticks like swords and laughing until he fell into the grass. I held that boy in my memory, not the man he'd become, not the stranger who stood silently beside a woman who mocked me, but the boy who once drew me pictures, who once kissed my cheek and called me a hero. I held him close, and then gently I let him go. Not out of bitterness, but because the boy I loved had outgrown me, and the man he became didn't remember the road he walked to get here. I didn't cry that night. I just breathed, deeply, finally, like someone who had stepped off a train that had been moving too fast for too long. The wedding would go on, the flowers would bloom, the champagne would be poured, but I would no longer be footing the bill, not financially, not emotionally. And the silence that followed that choice, it wasn't empty. It was mine. The next morning I brewed myself a pot of strong coffee, not the single cup I usually made, but a full pot. There was something ceremonial about it, something final. I stood at the counter, hands warm around the mug, the steam curling upward like incense at a quiet altar. I felt no hesitation, just a strange, resolute calm. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect a woman to be when she withdraws support. I was just done. That afternoon I sat down with my paperwork. I found the binder where I kept everything. The emails about vendors, the payment schedules, the floral invoices, the venue contract. I had been their silent investor, their background benefactor. They never called it that, but that's what I was. The expectation was never voiced. It didn't need to be. They knew I would offer. They knew I would give. Because I always had. I reviewed every contribution I'd made so far. The down payment on the venue, the deposit for the photographer, a few thousand for the caterer. I had offered it all freely out of love, believing I was being invited into something sacred. But now I saw it clearly. I wasn't building a wedding. I was being used as scaffolding. And once the structure was standing, they had no intention of keeping me in the frame. So I made the calls. I started with the florist. Yes, I said, I'm the one listed on the account. I'm calling to cancel my contribution. She asked if I wanted to transfer the responsibility to someone else. I said no. Just remove my name. The caterer, next. I explained that the deposit would not be followed by a second payment. I'd forfeit it. Let them figure it out. One by one, I pulled the threads of my involvement loose, carefully, quietly. I didn't shout. I didn't write a dramatic letter. I didn't text my son in the middle of his workday, demanding explanations or apologies. No, this was not for them. It was for me. Because I had given them enough, more than enough. And now it was time they stood on their own 2 feet. After I'd made the last call, I sat back and felt a strange sensation come over me. Not guilt, though part of me had braced for it. Not regret, just weightlessness, like I had been carrying a pack for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to walk without it. My shoulders felt different. My breath felt deeper. I knew the reaction would come soon, that they'd notice, that she'd go into her spreadsheets and see a hole where my name used to be, that my son would receive a frantic call, maybe even a few tears for effect. And he'd call me. Oh yes, he'd call. And when he did, I was ready. The phone rang late that evening. His name blinked on the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. Hey, Mom, he said the way people say brace yourself without saying it. We saw some of the payments didn't go through. I paused for a moment, let the silence sit before I replied. That's right, I said softly. I canceled them. There was a pause. Then why? No anger yet, just confusion. Confusion that I, the ever-reliable, ever-generous mother, had done something so independent. I didn't raise my voice, didn't throw her insult back in his face. I just said I realized I was investing in a celebration I wasn't even part of. He didn't speak. So I continued. You and she made it clear that my presence is tolerated, not wanted. I was contributing to something that mocked me in return. That's not love. That's charity. And I don't do charity when it costs me my dignity. His voice came back smaller. It's not like that. But it is, I said gently. And maybe you don't see it because you're too close. Or maybe you do see it, and it's easier not to name it. But either way, I'm not paying to be humiliated. There was silence again. Longer this time. I imagined him sitting at their table, her in the background, listening, waiting to hear how much of me still remained pliable. He said, "So you're really pulling out?" I smiled sadly, softly. "No, sweetheart, I'm just stepping back. There's a difference." "Can we talk about this in person?" he asked, almost pleading. "I think you should talk to her first," I said. "Really talk, not just defend, not just placate, talk. Ask her why the woman who made you your first birthday cake now feels like a stranger in her own family." He didn't respond. I ended the call before it could turn into something else, an argument, a guilt trip, a reversal. I didn't want that. I wasn't asking for them to change. I wasn't demanding apologies. I was simply reclaiming my place, or rather choosing to leave it empty. That night I went for a walk. The air was cooler than expected. A breeze moved through the trees with a hush that felt like blessing. I didn't bring a phone, didn't bring anything, just myself and my shadow. And for once that was enough. The fallout came faster than I expected. By morning I had 3 missed calls and 2 texts from my son. I didn't respond, not out of malice, but because I already knew what they would say, and more importantly, I knew what I wouldn't. I wasn't going to explain the decision over voicemail, and I certainly wasn't going to let myself be pulled into the same old dance of guilt and smoothing over. That version of me, the one who flinched and fixed things, she'd been quietly laid to rest the night I tore up the check. By midday, a longer message came through. From her this time. Her first direct message to me in weeks. Just 3 sentences. "We were shocked to learn about your cancellations. This puts a lot of stress on us right before the wedding. I hope you'll reconsider for your son's sake. For his sake. Not for mine. Not for the sake of mending the hurt she'd caused, or acknowledging the sting of her words. No apology. No reflection. Just stress. Just pressure. Just the same old calculus. What can we still extract from this woman before she realizes she has power?" I didn't reply. A few hours later, the phone rang again. My son this time. I let it ring once, twice, then I picked up. His voice was tight. "Mom, can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted to hear what he meant by talk. "She's really upset," he continued. "I'm trying to keep everything together, and this isn't the time to back out. We were counting on you." "I know," I said calmly. Then why, he asked, voice cracking just a little. "Why now?" "Because I've been backing out quietly for years," I said. "This is just the first time you noticed." There was a silence on the other end that stretched wide and raw. Then came the edge of defensiveness, familiar, automatic. "You're making this about you. This is supposed to be our day." "And I've spent a lifetime making everything about everyone else," I replied. "One day out of thousands for myself is not cruelty. It's survival." He sighed. "You could have told me, instead of just cutting everything." "I did tell you," I said softly. "Not in words, maybe, but in all the silences. In all the moments I let slide, you just weren't listening. I didn't know she hurt you so much. That almost got me. Almost. A part of me wanted to fold then and there to soothe him, to soften the blow, but I remembered what that softness had cost me. She laughed at my gift, his name. I said, voice trembling but firm. She made me a joke, and you let her. She didn't mean it like that. But she did, and you knew it. You've known it for a long time. You just didn't want to choose. The line went still. And then came the words I had dreaded and yet already expected. So, are you still coming to the wedding? A simple question, but it held the weight of everything, and I had my answer ready, not rehearsed, not cold, just clear. I haven't decided. He didn't try to argue, he didn't beg, just said, okay, and hung up. For the rest of the day, the silence returned. Not the cold kind, the kind I'd lived with for too long. This one was mine, claimed, chosen. It didn't ache like it used to. It felt clean, almost peaceful. But I knew the real storm hadn't arrived yet. That evening her mother called. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. Her tone was sweet, too sweet, like honey hiding vinegar. I just wanted to reach out personally, she said, because I know you've been under a lot of strain. I didn't say anything. She continued, we all appreciate how generous you've been, truly. And I think we both know this wedding is really about bringing families together. Wouldn't it be a shame if this little misunderstanding ruined that? There it was. Polite manipulation wrapped in a smile. She wasn't calling to understand. She was calling to negotiate my silence again. To rope me back into the system where I gave and they took, and no one ever said thank you. So I said something I hadn't said in years, maybe ever. No. Just that. She waited. No to what exactly? No to pretending. No to paying. No to coming just to be humiliated quietly in the background. No to buying a seat at a table that no one really wants me at. There was a long pause. I think you're being very emotional. And I smiled. Oh, how I smiled. Emotion, I said gently, is what happens when someone finally tells the truth, after years of swallowing it. She made a polite goodbye, told me I was welcome to rejoin the process if I changed my mind, and then she hung up. I sat in the stillness after the call, and for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of myself. Not for what I'd said, but for what I hadn't. I hadn't apologized. I hadn't explained. I hadn't backed down. The calls stopped after that. The texts slowed. And in the silence that followed, something new began to bloom. Not loneliness, but self-respect. And that grows quietly, but with roots strong enough to lift the foundation of a life. You never forget the first morning you wake up and don't feel obligated. No mental checklist of who to call, what to buy, how to show up in a way that might finally earn you love. That morning I opened my eyes and simply lay there. The sunlight drifted in like it always had, but it felt softer somehow. I didn't rush to check my phone. I didn't rehearse answers to questions no one had asked yet. I just breathed. It was strange how light my body felt without the weight of unspoken expectations pressing against my chest. No one tells you that boundaries feel like grief at first, like failure, because for so long I had equated closeness with endurance. I thought love meant carrying everything, absorbing everything. Now I was learning that peace doesn't always come with a smile. Sometimes it comes with a firm no, and the silence that follows. The wedding was 2 weeks away. I hadn't received another message, no new calls, no updates. I suppose they assumed I was still simmering, waiting for an apology for the door to crack open so I could slip back in. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I spent those 2 weeks tending my garden. It had been neglected during all the bridal events and errands and trips to stores for things they didn't need but insisted they had to have. I clipped the roses back, reseeded the patch by the fence. There was something healing in it, digging into the soil with my bare hands, letting the earth remind me how to root myself. And as I worked, I thought about all the times I'd crossed my own boundaries, just to avoid being seen as difficult. The dinners I showed up for with a forced smile, the holidays I hosted while exhausted, the errands I ran, the favors I did, the checks I wrote, all with the hope that they'd finally look at me and say, "We see you, we need you." But all they saw was what I could give, not who I was. And the more I gave, the more invisible I became. That's the thing people don't realize about women like me, quiet women. The ones who always say yes, the ones who show up with hot meals and careful hands and open hearts. We look soft, but we are not weak. We just hope. And hope is the most dangerous strength of all, because it keeps us standing at doors that never open. Well, I had walked away from that door, and every step since had felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. One afternoon, I drove to the bakery I used to visit when my son was little. I ordered a lemon tart and sat by the window watching the light spill over the table. I had forgotten how much I liked being alone. Not lonely alone. There's a difference. Alone is a quiet cafe, your favorite pastry, no one rushing you. Alone is peace with no performance. I saw a couple walk by the window, young, holding hands full of the glossy brightness of people who think their love is invincible. I didn't resent them. I hoped they made it. I hoped they held on to each other when the shine wore off and the real work began. But I also hoped if they ever had children, they would remember not to cut out the people who had raised them. I drove home and sat on my porch as the sun dipped low. A soft breeze tugged at the hem of my sweater. The wind chimes danced a little, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. The anger had flared, yes, but now it had cooled into something clearer, wiser. It wasn't rage that kept me from the wedding plans. It was knowing what I deserved. And I deserved more than crumbs. I deserved more than a seat at the edge of a table I had helped set. I deserved joy. I deserved reciprocity. I deserved to be held in the light, not hidden in the corner. That evening I made myself a simple dinner, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, a glass of wine. I lit a candle not for anyone else, not for a guest or a holiday, just for me. I ate slowly, savoring each bite. And it hit me halfway through. This is what peace tastes like. Not just food without tension, but life without begging. I didn't need to buy my way back into their affection. I didn't need to prove anything with checks or casseroles or quiet compliance. I had said enough, given enough. And now I was learning to receive, not from them, from myself. And from the silence that at last felt like company. The wedding day came and went without me. No one called that morning. No one asked if I was on my way. No one offered a last-minute apology or invitation or even an excuse. And I didn't expect them to. I had made my decision, and I suppose in their minds that made me dramatic, difficult, cold. I imagine her mother muttering something like, "She did this for attention." I imagine the guests asking where I was. I imagine someone making up a stomach bug to smooth over the awkwardness. That's fine. Let them talk. Let them assume. Because I didn't give them a scene. I gave them silence. And what I gave her, what I gave them, was distance, boundaries. The gift they never thought I'd be strong enough to offer. I didn't crash their party. I didn't stand up at the rehearsal dinner and make a speech. I didn't send the quilt back with a scathing letter. I didn't leave cryptic comments under their wedding photos or share bitter posts online. I simply didn't show up. And I can't tell you how powerful that felt. There was no bitterness in my absence, only clarity, only grace. Instead of going to the wedding, I went to the sea. I packed a small bag left early and drove until the highway faded into dunes and wind. I checked into a modest little inn where no one knew my name, the kind of place with creaky floors and chipped teacups and windows that opened to the sound of waves. I hadn't done anything like that for myself in years, decades, maybe. That afternoon, while they were posing for photos with airbrushed smiles and rented joy, I was walking barefoot along the shoreline. The tide kissed my ankles, the breeze tangled in my hair, and I thought about all the versions of myself I'd shed along the way, the mother who begged to be invited, the woman who apologized for her own presence, the giver who gave past the point of exhaustion. I stood still and let the water rush around me, let the wind take what it wanted. And in that moment I forgave them, not because they asked, but because I didn't want to carry them anymore. I released the ache, the need, the illusion. I let it all go like shells slipping through open fingers. And then I forgave myself for all the times I stayed too long, for all the nights I cried into my pillow and called it love, for every time I said, "It's fine," when it was anything but. Later that evening, I wrote a letter I never planned to send. I don't know why, maybe for closure, maybe for myself. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. You laughed at my gift, but you didn't break me. You ignored me. But I see myself clearly now. I didn't cancel the wedding. I simply chose not to fund my own erasure. That's not vengeance. That's self-respect. And what I gave you instead of money or presents was something you'll only understand when you're older, when you realize that love is not measured in how much someone tolerates, but how much they refuse to let themselves be diminished. I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal. Maybe one day I'll leave it behind for someone to find. Maybe no one ever will. That's all right. That night I watched the sun set into the sea. It didn't apologize for leaving. It just did softly, silently, gloriously. And the sky didn't beg it to stay. It just let it go. As the sky darkened, I lit a candle by the window and made a quiet toast. To all the women who leave with grace. To all the mothers who love enough to let go. To all the hearts that refuse to be bought. To peace. To dignity. To starting over. There's something sacred about choosing yourself, especially when the world has spent decades teaching you not to. It doesn't happen in a single grand gesture. It happens in the quiet moments, the pauses, the stillness that follows heartbreak and becomes healing. I learned that I don't have to raise my voice to reclaim my place. I don't have to shout to say I matter. I don't have to give until I disappear, just to be loved halfway. Some truths don't need to be spoken, they simply need to be honored. And maybe I'll never sit at that table again. Maybe they'll go on unbothered painting me as the one who ruined a beautiful day. But the story they tell isn't mine anymore. I've stepped out of that chapter, closed the book, because I remember who I am now. A woman who gave everything she had. And then when the giving was no longer sacred, stopped. It wasn't revenge. It was release. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to explain. I just needed to stop feeding hands that only reached for me when they were empty. I chose silence, and in it, I found peace. Because some endings aren't loud. Some endings come like the soft click of a door that you lock behind you, not to trap someone out, but to protect what's left of yourself inside. And from that quiet place, I begin again. Not bitter, not broken, just free.